Thank you all for coming. I'm Lauren Colbert, and Samir, Junnarkar, and I are the co-chairs of the SIEPR Young Associates program. SIEPR Young Associates has given us a great opportunity and privilege to attend this and other SIEPR events throughout the year and maintain our connection to Stanford after graduating. So we're very pleased to be here. And we're also pleased to introduce this panel on millennials, which I don't have too much expertise on, but being a member of the target demographic, I guess I can say I have some. So I'd like to introduce Hilary Hoynes, who will be moderating the panel. She is a professor of economics and public policy at our friend across the bay, UC Berkeley. She has also been a co-editor of the American Economic Review and the American Economic Journal. And she has a PhD in economics from Stanford and an undergraduate degree in econ and math from Colby College.
I'd like to introduce both of our panelists. We have Paul Oyer, who is a professor in economics from Stanford's GSB. Paul does research in the field of personnel economics, the study of human resource management within firms. So, for instance, what incentives does Apple put in place to incentivize the productivity of its workplace? Last year, he published a book called What Online Dating Can Teach Us About Economics. So clearly he knows quite a bit of something about millennials and their behavior.
I didn't date any, by the way. For the record.
Research. And he is joined on this panel by Maude Standish. She has been a millennials trend forecaster for the last decade. And she currently is the director of strategy at Mistress Creative, an internationally renowned ad agency that creates integrated brand campaigns, social movements, and influencer campaigns. She has written for Vice and Huffington Post and was featured in Forbes 30 Under 30.
All right. Thank you so much for those great introductions, and thank you all for coming. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out, and each one of our panelists are going to sort of give a short statement. I think Maude is going to go first.
Sure.
And then Paul will give some comments, and then I'll start things off by asking a few questions, and then quickly turn things over to the audience and get your questions and continue the conversation through the allotted time. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Maude.
Thanks. I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me here. I'm super honored to be here. It's kind of strange sitting back here, actually. It's odd. I think one of the things that I'm going to start off with for just a second is to explain what trend forecasting is, because I know that sometimes that conjures up an image of somebody that's just sitting around and saying, I think that thing's cool, and then all of a sudden it's on magazines. That's not exactly what I do. It's actually much more research-based. It's looking at qualitative research and quantitative research and trying to see the patterns and hoping that you can guess where those patterns are going and how the macro trends will change over time. And then the work that we do is actually work that is more innovation-based, so trying to work with companies on developing new products and marketing that will appeal to millennials. So that's sort of what I do, and I think that's why I'm here. There's a lot of things that you can say about the millennial generation, not all that many that are nice, probably, from most people's perspective. One of the biggest things that my job is as a millennial expert is kind of sitting and listening to people talk a lot of smack about millennials. They talk about how they're entitled and how they're always jumping ship. And all of that is actually true. But the thing is that it was their parents that did it to them. And I think that's something that is often forgotten. We are an entitled generation. We were raised very differently from other generations. One thing that's often forgotten is that Gen Xers and millennials actually share the same parents, the boomers. Gen Xers were born were teenagers in the 80s, and their mothers were off at work, and so all of a sudden you had this new development of the latchkey child. What happened with millennials, which I think is one of the biggest shifts that happened for them, is everyone was like, oh no, we can't have these kids coming home to houses that are empty. So what they actually did is they put in place a lot of structure, which is after-school programs, getting good grades, going to all of these activities, and all of a sudden you have a generation that's hyper-oriented towards success and tangible rewards and getting their praise because they've done that their entire life. So it's always a little bit surprising to me when people are like, then they come into the workplace and they want all this praise. It's like, well, for the last 22 years, that's what they've gotten, so I don't know why you would think that would shift. The other big thing, I think, is that they did have these very, what we like to call helicopter parents, who really hovered around them and tried to make them succeed. They are a massive generation, as I'm sure you guys know. They recently were recognized as the largest generation in America, bigger than even the boomers, due somewhat to immigration and mortality rates. But they are a massive generation, and their parents saw that and knew how hard it was going to be to stand out. So they focused on telling them, you are special and you can stand out at every step of the way. And what that did to them is that made them highly optimistic about their own personal success in the long run, and also about their personal characteristics. But then they had this thing that happened to them, which is that they graduated into a recession. So they did all of the things that they were told to do. They got all the good grades, they learned all the languages, they went to China at 17, as we heard. They did all of those things. And all of a sudden, the thing that was supposed to be there, the big office, that big job that made a lot of sense, wasn't there for them. It just crumbled before them. And not only that, not only was their job not there for them, but their parents' jobs weren't there for their parents. And in fact, big institutions that they thought were going to survive forever just crumbled right before their eyes. And so there was an unease that hit them. But they're very optimistic. So what they did, instead of getting nervous about this, is they actually enacted a bunch of paradigm shifts that we're all still reacting to this. Instead of thinking, oh, shoot, I'm so angry that I can't get that mansion, they said, I don't want a mansion. Ownership isn't, to me, about owning something. It's about access to the thing when I want it. And they continued to move all of these different paradigms so that they still felt successful within their own life, even if it wasn't matching up to the roadmap that they had seen before. One of the big things that we see in corporate culture, of course, is this idea that millennials are constantly trying to move on to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And I thought the answers today were so accurate, because it's not that they're trying to escape, it's that they're constantly trying to learn. And the reason that they're doing that, and this is the last thing I'll say before we go on to deeper dives of them, the reason that they're doing that is that they're really conservative, actually, as a generation. They're trying to check all of the boxes. Think about Gen Xers, they rebelled in a big way. Think about even boomers, they took to the streets. Millennials, on the other hand, have always kind of done what you told them to do. They don't want to disrupt the system. They want to optimize the system, actually. They're always constantly looking for ways to make things bigger and better and faster, but it's not changing everything. It's not changing the whole world as we know it. They saw that the traditional safety nets that they wanted to be there, like a good job, a 401k, and all of those things that were support networks that would build you out into old age, weren't going to be there when they got there. And they even hear from their own president, who they see as a president that they elected, that the jobs of the future don't yet exist today. He says that all the time. That is the scariest thing to hear when you're constantly trying to train for a job of the future. What do you do? So millennials, being the conservative and optimistic generation that they are, they decided they would put all their bets into the only asset that they 100% know will exist in their future, themselves. And so they put a lot of their attention into building their personal brand. And this isn't because they want fame, and it's not because they need all of your recognition, but it's because they know that if the startup they're at collapses or wherever they are falls apart, the one thing that they'll have they can always carry along with them is themselves and their sense of their personal brand, no matter what happens in the world around them. Just a weird overview.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So, Paul, why don't you
So I have a very different perspective, being an empirical labor economist. By way of background, my relationship to this topic is that I have 2 millennial children. That's about all I can think of that brings me here. But I am an empirical labor economist, and I see things a little differently than Maude does. I'm not going to disagree with anything she said at all. I'm just going to tell you. Well, no. So first of all, start with a few facts. And, the data I have is on men here. So they hold on average 7 jobs in the first 10 years of their working lives. They change jobs mostly to take higher paying jobs. And in a given person in the first 10 years of their career, there's a 50-50 chance, conditional on a job lasting 1 year, there's a 50-50 chance it'll last 2 years. So that's the instability of young workers. Now, that's not the millennials. What I just told you about is from a paper in 1992 by a couple of labor economists, Bob Topel and Michael Ward, and they were studying people even older than me. They were studying people who were born between 1938 and 1954. So the idea that millennials have some of the I want to try to, I don't, while I don't want to disagree with anything Maude said, because I think it's all exactly right, I want to remind you that the millennials have a big other characteristic that I think dominates everything else, and that is that they're young. And young people have always been different and unstable and disagreeable with their parents and all sorts of things like that. Short attention spans are not a millennial thing. Short attention spans for people in the age group of 18 to 26 is not a millennial thing. That's the way history has always worked. So put another way, when it comes to the labor market, younger people have always been different than older people, and that will continue with the millennials. So what's actually different about millennials, and here's where I think at least one place I'm going to completely agree with what Maude said. So I can think of, if you look in the data, I can think of 3 ways in which millennials are noticeably different from the generations that came before them. One of them is the rise of inequality. So what's different about the world that millennials grew up in is, I grew up in a world that was unequal, but not that unequal. And we all live in a world where, the bifurcation of incomes has just gone crazy since I was a kid. And I'm going to guess it's going to get more and more that way. I'm not really sure. Probably the single most important force in the labor market for a long time now, I would say. And so the generations, these kids are always going to be very bifurcated. I think that's very problematic, not for the types of people Maude has been talking about and analyzing, which has mostly been upper middle class millennials, but there's a whole group of people whose parents aren't in this room who, their millennial world is very different than ours, and it's going to be a bigger hole for them to climb out of than the poor. I came from a relatively privileged background, but there are a lot of poor kids in my day who had an easier time climbing out. The data don't yet show that that's really become much harder to move between classes. So we'll see if that does become more of a problem over time. I would guess it will, but there's not a lot of data to say that has become more and more of a problem yet. There's a lot of differences, by the way, nothing to do with in terms of moving between classes by geography and other things, but there's no evidence that it's gotten harder and harder just yet. The second big thing that I think is different about the millennials is it's the best time ever to be a woman. And, I'm very bullish on the future of women in the labor market. Right. So, it's simple economics. Up until not that long ago, the returns to strength in the labor market were huge. And men had a big advantage. I'm not that strong, so luckily I didn't have to worry about this. But men back in the day, that's what made them better workers. And so simple economics says that's gone away. Simple sociology says discrimination against women and acceptance of the breaking of gender barriers and the social norms that say women, it's fine to be out in the workplace and so forth, that's changed dramatically as well. And so women are definitely on the rise and going to continue to do better. And let me just give you some numbers if you don't already know these. Women get 57% of the BAs and 62.6% of the graduate degrees in the United States right now. So for every 3 men that graduate from college, 4 women graduate. Or put another way, for every 2 women, sorry, I've got this backwards. For every 2 men that get a graduate degree, 3 women get a graduate degree. And that's that's literally flipped symmetrically since 1970. So, and education, as a labor economist, I can tell you, the only thing that really matters, not the only thing, but the most important thing that predicts your success in the labor market is your education. So everything's tilting, 40 years of tilting towards the women. So, and I think that'll probably continue. Now, there's a big force pulling women down, and that's what they major in. And, I'm not going to stick my foot in my mouth like others have on this topic and try to explain why this happens the way it does. But boys major in different things than women. So let me give you a couple of quick numbers. Again, of the bachelor's degrees given in the United States in recent years, 85% of those in the health fields have been to women. 85% to nursing and things like that. 80% of degrees in education have been to women. 18% of engineering degrees go to women. And so Engineers earn 25 to 30% more than psychology majors straight out of school, and it may expand after that, and they earn 60% more than art majors. So if you just sort of think, okay, women are getting educated, that's great, they're majoring in the wrong thing, so from an income perspective, we're not exactly sure exactly how that trend's going to go, but I'm still bullish on the women in the long term. Because the trends are a little bit in the right direction on engineering and other physical sciences, but there's not a sea change there yet. I can just tell you anecdotally, from having lived with some millennials, I remember sitting in the dorm when I would, for a while my house was being remodeled, I lived in a dorm here at Stanford. I don't recommend that, but that's another story. And every night we would sit down to dinner with undergrads, and it was just ridiculous. If it was a young woman, she was majoring in human biology or maybe economics, but human biology or some arts thing. And if it was a guy, he was majoring in computer science and engineering. It was, anecdotally, it was overwhelming here at Stanford. Okay, sorry. The third factor that the millennials are dealing with from a labor market perspective, as Maude mentioned, is they came out they came out of school. Many of them came out of college during the Great Recession. I happen to have done some research on this. There's broader research by Lisa Kahn, Phil Oreopoulos, Til van Wachter, other noted labor economists showing that basically when you go into the labor market, being skilled is very good. Everything else equal, you want to be skilled. And it turns out you also want to be lucky. Now, if you have to choose between them, you want to choose skilled, by the way. You don't get to choose, but if you do, you want to choose skilled. That's more important. But coming out of school at the right time has this just enormous impact on a lot of people, and you're stuck with it for a long time. So I'm not that worried about the millennials because, the recession was bad, but after a few years, they'll mostly catch up after 10 years, and the scars are not going to be that great if you look at the numbers. I'm really worried about the millennials in Greece and Spain. So there you're just like, this whole idea of a lost generation, it's pretty dramatic. The unemployment rates are so big, and the amount of human capital that's being lost, or I should say, the amount of opportunity to develop human capital that's not being gained because the millennials are sitting around instead of out working is real problematic. So anyway, just to reiterate, my main theme is, for the most part, millennials are different because they're young, not because they're that different. Young people are always different from old people, but millennials, like prior generations, I just don't think they're that different from the young people that came before them. People have been complaining about kids' work ethic since, the Stone Ages. That's not really all that different. So to the extent that they are different, it's because the world has changed. And then just to, again, reiterate the point Maude made, I think when we think of millennials as being different, it's because we in this room know people who maybe are a little different, but even they are just maybe, they're different because the world has changed, not because they're different. And what I mean by that is, don't think of Stanford grads and grads of similar schools as too representative of the millennial generation. 1/3 of people get college bachelor's degrees these days. So we're leaving, more than, that number sounded too low, but that's what I found recently. And so if that's true, we're leaving 2/3 of the people out of the conversation. And then if you talk about people at prestigious schools like we're all trying to get our kids into, then you've narrowed that funnel down even finer. I mean, much less than 1%, much fewer than 1% of the graduates of college went to Ivy Leagues or anything you would associate with the Ivy League. The vast majority are going to schools that, you're not as proud telling people your kids went to and so forth. People who went to Cal State are probably more like their parents than you think your kids are. They want traditional jobs. They want to be trained in the trades and that sort of thing. And so anyway, I probably went over my allotted time, but that's a very different way of thinking about the millennials.
Thank you very much, both of you, for those great introductions. Just to kick things off, I'm a good student. I do what I'm told. I'm supposed to moderate a panel on millennials, and like Paul, I've got 2 in my household, or 1 in and 1 out of the household, so I know something, but not very much. So I did what anybody would do. They sit down and Google millennials. So in the top 3 items when I Googled millennials this morning, One of them was, believe it or not, a report by the Council on Economic Advisors about millennials with 14 facts about millennials. About half of them were mentioned between the two of you. I don't have them all written down, but it was pretty remarkable. You
A
guys,
little bit.
you know.
We're cheating a little because you sent me the report.
Yeah, okay. You didn't have to say that. Okay, but here's what I didn't tell you. The other thing I found, which was really fun, which was interestingly on the Pew
Research.
Center, right? I thought maybe you might know something about this. So here was the fun thing. Don't pull it up on your phones right now, though you will be tempted, because it was 14 questions to get your score on how much of a millennial you are. And so the questions, the 14 questions, I won't read them all, but to give you a little smattering of what the questions were, they were things like, in the last 24 hours, did you watch more than 1 hour of TV programming? Did you read a newspaper? We all know how that goes. In paper form, I believe it said. Did you play more than an hour of video games? Do you have a landline? How many texts did you send in the last day? And there were sort of bins. And then things got sort of more interesting. Many of those themes seem to be kind of not so surprising to me. Some other things that got a little bit more interesting to me, one of them, and it's where I want to go with starting a question for you, Maude. One of them was, have you contacted a government official in any time over the last, I can't remember what it was, week, month, something like that? And this really got me to thinking about what thoughts you might have in any way about the relationship that millennials have to their government. Because an observation is that it seems like we're in a place right now where Americans' faith in government is rather low. And I don't know that well enough to know how those opinions about government are really broken down by generation, age, to get back to Paul's point that young people are different than older people. But it strikes me that millennials, in their connection with technology and everything else and the life and the way in which they've grown up, the question is, what do you think about millennials' relationship to government? And as someone who advises firms, how might you advise the Obama administration in terms of how they might reach millennials more with their message or their messaging?
Okay, so I think one of the things that I want to say before I even start is that I think actually Paul and I agree more than maybe he thinks.
No.
One of the things that we study when we study generations is that we look at their cohort traits, their generational traits, and their life stage traits. And so we look at a mix of those things and we try to understand, that life stage is going to play this massive role, and it does with government too, if you think about it. When you're moving around, it's a little bit harder to be connected to a local government, let's say. So if you're constantly changing jobs and you're flying all around because you're a consultant, or if you're not in the upper tier and you're, moving with the job or whatever it is, it's just a little bit harder when you're in that life stage where you're still trying to settle everything down to be focused on government in that way. The other thing about millennials, why one of the big reasons that we think of them as this young generation is because they are marrying later. Their cohort traits tend to extend further. So that means that traits go faster back and forth. That's why trends kind of fly around within millennials a little bit. But it keeps them in sort of this young state of mind that I think does relate back to a lot of the things that we're talking about, including government. In terms of government, I think millennials want to believe in government. I mean, you saw that with the first election of Obama. There's definitely that desire to have that belief. They also grew up in the age where, their president was disgraced. And that is a very real thing for them. Some of the first pieces of news that we always hear about are, Bill Clinton getting a blowjob, and I'm serious. Like when you're like 12, you're like, whoa, that's crazy, because you don't even know what any of those things are. And then somebody has to sit and explain it to you, and it sits with you that that's something that your president has been disgraced for. And then with an age of transparency, you keep hearing more and more about all of this corruption, and you see how untransparent government is and how it's functioning so differently from all of this other stuff that you start to believe in. And that lack of transparency kind of leads to even more and more of a distrust with it. And it makes you feel like this is something so far away from me that I don't have the possibility of actually enacting upon. Why am I going to put my resources there? And and sometimes I hear, and I'm not saying this room thinks this, that means that they think that millennials aren't involved, but they are. They just involve themselves differently. They try to put their effort into hyper-local situations so that because they can see the outcome, they can understand what's happening they want a reaction from their action. They don't want to just put their action out there and then think, nothing is going to come of this, my vote doesn't matter, this doesn't matter, none of that matters. In addition, it's not even that they don't want to give money to things. I mean, if you look at Kickstarter, they're giving massive, people always say that millennials don't give money to charity, but Kickstarter is charity. They don't own parts of those companies. They don't own any of that. If you look at the most successful Kickstarters, the founder usually talks about what it's going to do for the community first. And, that is them trying to give back to the community in a kind of way that they understand. I think what the government could potentially do, obviously, the more transparency, the better, obviously. But also try to explain things to them, in a way that is interesting. I think that's what Obama did the first time around. He talked about hope. He made it emotional. He took the language of brands and infused them into politics. He hired, artists that were of their generation to communicate with them. I've done some work with politicians in the past, and one of the big things I notice is they give their information in this kind of static form of a press release. And I'm like, do you see what is working and communicating right now? It's BuzzFeed. It's image-based, it's conversational, it's stories, it's information that you can use as social currency when you're out with your friends or your family. And I think if the government sort of took some of the language and understandings that brands have taken in order how to communicate complex ideas, that might be actually one of the first steps that would be really useful to re-engaging millennials into it, the government as well. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. So does it seem like that's something that, even beyond 2008, that the president, you see in the way that messages are delivered?
No, actually, and I love Obama. I'm from Chicago. This is so hard for me to even criticize him, but I think one of the things is that as he got absorbed into the system, he became as wonky as the system is, and it's when his great speeches happen, he gets so away from it, right? And you get so excited, and we all rally towards it, and then I personally think he is such an intelligent guy that he understands all the small pieces, and he gets super wonky in those small pieces, and all of a sudden it just doesn't matter, and you don't feel like you can affect any of those small pieces or they have a relationship to your day-to-day. So it's hard to put your effort and desire into that space when you could go honestly to a Kickstarter or a nonprofit. I look at 826. Do you know that nonprofit?
Valencia? 826 Valencia?
No, they basically are a literacy program.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
826 Valencia.
I guess they have them everywhere. So they're in Chicago and Los Angeles, and it's so the way they communicate is fun. It's fresh. They bring enjoyment back into the space of giving, but they also show you, if you give money to them, they tell you the direct story of what's happening with it. They're super transparent to their donors. And then they talk to you about the problems in a way that are narrative-based rather than just here are the wonky details. We think that government's uninteresting, but then look at House of Cards. That is one of the most successful shows right now, and it's government, but made interesting by telling a narrative around it. And
By a lot of murders.
Yeah, but the murder part aside, but the other part is interesting too. The power struggle is interesting. What is actually happening behind the scenes, because we don't have any of that. And I know that not all of that can be given, but there is a way to insert narrative into these issues because they are issues that have narratives, and that's why we're passionate about them. If they didn't have something that we were trying to achieve that was important for us and the world around us, nobody would care. We would just let it go to the wayside, but that isn't communicated. It's talked about in very abstract formulations that nobody can put their heart or soul into. Or not nobody, but it is difficult for a millennial to do when they have things like House of Cards and all of these amazing shows competing for their attention. It's an attention-based economy, and the government has to know that they're part of that. They don't automatically get the attention, they have to earn it.
I wanted to follow up on one of the things you said, and it connects to something that I had read in this Council on Economic Advisors report, and that is in asking millennials about what attributes they're looking for in a job and how that compares to other generations. one thing that sticks out, which I think is in principle, not just because they're young, because I think they were measuring different generations at the beginning of their career, was a higher value placed on earnings. Yet at the same time, we also know that millennials, just following very much up on one of the things you just talked about, are hyper-involved, hyper-local, very community-oriented. They've spent a lot of time before college, during college, after college, giving back to the community. And on the surface, those two things seem in opposition. And I wonder if you have any sort of thoughts about that.
Well, I'm sure you guys have seen these statistics. Millennials actually believe that corporations can do more good than the government. And one of the things is that they understand the power of their wallet. They are very brand savvy. They understand that buying one brand that donates to this or does whatever, that is making kind of like a social choice as well. And they see their world kind of in this way that, like, even this bottle of water, every choice you make has some sort of impact, and you're constantly thinking about the karmatic impact of your purchases. And so they are very understanding of that money gives you the right to make choices that you think are good for the world. In general, I think millennials, just like everybody else, want to be valued and so the other thing that they want usually in a workspace is a manager. I think we all want that, a manager who's really helping them grow. That's a sign of value. But then money is also a sign of value too, and they understand that, and so they seek it out. And their working today is different from working 30 years ago. If you are a high achiever today, it's a global economy, which means that you are on 24/7. We talk about actually how time has been made into moments. Time used to be relatively static, where you had, this was friend time, this was work time, this was my time. Now everything is sort of all together because you're constantly friending while you're in work, and you're constantly working while it's your time. And since work has encroached so much on their personal life, and they don't have, if they're going to give away that luxury of time, they want to make sure that they're getting the most back from it. So I actually see two choices happening a lot. If they're going to take a full-time job that is going to take all of their time, they want to make sure they're making the most money for that. Or if they're not going to get that, then they don't want to go into that full-time job. They want to go and do something mission-based, or you see them going and traveling or starting their own startups because they want to make sure that they're making the most of this luxury of time, which they don't have. Does that make sense? I feel like I said that in a convoluted way, but.
Thank you. So Paul, one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is to follow up on this, what I see to be, these two twin forces that are really defining the moment, which to some extent is going to be affecting all generations, but we know that oftentimes at the beginning and that school to work transition is such a critical time for cohorts. And those two twin forces are inequality and the Great Recession. And I liked your reminder that, inequality means that there's more than one millennial generation, yet it seems like when we talk about the characteristics of the millennials, it does seem to be very weighed towards those more advantaged. And I wonder, what do you see as that sort of manifestation of inequality intersecting with this generation? And how do you think it's affecting what we see in terms of labor market opportunities and that in the lens of this incredible Great Recession?
Yeah, I think I worry about the future a lot. I think in the following sense, the inequality, I feel like is really, when you think about what kind of job are you going to get if you don't have a college education now, I don't understand two things, and it's not just a millennial thing, it has to do with people our age as well, and that is why people who aren't that educated tend to often vote Republican rather than their own, as I see it, their own wallet. I might be wrong, I might be missing something about it. And then, when's the revolution coming is the other thing I sort of worry about. When you think about the forces being as great as they are, and I think, if you have a kid in college as well, and if you walk around the Stanford campus, if you take your kid on one of these college tours these days, it's just incredible what the good universities have. It's like every parent has the same thing the first time they go visit Princeton or Williams College on a tour. It's like, can I go too, right?
Right.
Everybody, and I can't believe they added this stuff since I was there. Now, if you go to, again, let's use Cal State as an example. It's not quite the same. It's just not the same even there. It's, it's better than it was when we were kids, but it's just not, it's better than like a British boarding school or something, but it's just not the same school experience that these kids, more privileged kids have. And so, yeah, I don't know now I'm getting out of economics into areas I don't know about. I just don't know from a social fabric point of view how, when the millennial generation keeps going, what's going to happen.
Well, to follow up on that a little bit, there was a report out recently that I saw written up on the Huffington Post about education in a broader sense of the millennials, and in particular, the observation is your generation, the millennial generation, is the most educated generation of any generation in America. We know that educational trends are going up, educational attainment is going up, postgraduate education is the new college degree and all of that, and the data is very clear on that. Yet when you compare Americans to other countries, and so the report out recently was not an education report. It was an assessment of skills, not a PISA test that we have for kids in school age, but a skill-based test for employees. And within that analysis, it had the millennial generation. There were 23 countries in this assessment. And on literacy, we were, the United States, 17 out of 23. And on numeracy, we were 21st out of 23. And so the question is, while we know that opportunities at the very top are excellent, but when we step back just a little bit, what does this, how do we make sense of this and the importance of it within a global labor market that's very competitive?
Right. So the big thing there is the labor market has become more global. The jobs that, that used to be middle-class jobs here are now done, not so much in, some maybe countries at the top of that list, but countries that maybe aren't even on that list, India, Mexico, places like this. But when I think about, the thing I wonder about is inequality in the U.S. is greater than most anywhere else. And I wonder if that's what drives these test results, because those look at the average. Mm-hmm. And so I'm betting, and you never see it done this way, I'm betting I'll put our top 10% up against any other country's top 10%. And I bet we're doing, think about it. Where are the best universities? They're still here. Thank God. And so I think that could be, if you look at those test score things, I'd love to see the whole distribution on that. I bet you that's more a case, again, of we have what you call long, would it be left tail or right tail?
I'd say left.
Left tail
Yeah.
in this case. We have a long left tail, and I think that's really problematic. And I think it comes from, these back to the idea of government. We don't have the safety net. We don't have the sort of infrastructure that maybe some of these other places have. And then the other thing I think that's interesting is if you look at these lists of who does really well, two countries always jump out as having high test scores. One is Japan and the other is Finland. And I think these are really interesting examples because it comes back to another theme I mentioned before, and that is gender equality. One of them is like the most gender equal place in the world, and the other, Japan has a big dogfight every year with South Korea for who can score worst among developed countries in gender equality. Okay, South Korea, I think, they're fighting out with South Korea. I like to say that in South Korea, the women are really good golfers because they can't get any other jobs. And so, that's obviously meant to be a joke, but if you look at the data, South Korea is just and Japan, very tough place to be a professional woman. And so I think what you find, what you do is when you look at some of those other countries and you look at the test scores that are so good, I would be really optimistic about certain groups. Japanese men in the future, right? Unless the social norms change there, and Finnish women. Finnish women are setting themselves up to be very successful because, the educational infrastructure has been wonderful, and things are hopefully moving, the inequality isn't that great. So anyway.
So I have one other thing that I want to ask both of you to comment on, and then we'll turn it over to questions from the audience, where I'm sure you've been thinking of some things that you want to ask our esteemed panelists. So one thing that didn't come up from either of you is another feature, I think, that is pretty apparent with the millennial generation, yet this may be something that's difficult to disentangle from the Great Recession, and that is, anybody? Well, yeah, that's true. We haven't talked that much about technology. What I was going to say, maybe that's just because I have a 21-year-old child and I'm thinking of her graduating from college soon, that is, how many millennials are still living at home? So, what is happening in terms of this transition, this sort of delayed transition from home to independent living? And again, part of this might be not generational in terms of their norms and preferences, but more the economy that they're living in. So I wonder if both of you might comment on that before we turn it over to the audience.
Do you want to go first? It's true, a lot of millennials live at home. It's more definitely than the boomers and Xers and for longer, and I don't have the specific numbers in front of me, but that is true. It's actually more true for boys than it is for girls, too. And it's interesting because I can talk a little bit about the societal things that it's doing. And one of the societal things that it's doing that you guys should be really excited about is that millennials actually, when you ask them, about 83%, I think it is, say that it's their responsibility to take care of their parents when they're older. And what they mean by that is specifically move them into their house. And so one of the things that I think that has happened is you've seen the family unit change a little bit. And it's really different from boomers and Xers, actually. Those numbers are significantly different. And I think what you've seen is the concept of what a house is changing a little bit in society. A house used to be a way to stake out your independence and to formulate your family. That was what you did. You either the GI Bill, you left the army, you got a wife, you got some kids, you made a little fort for your family, and then you pushed the kids out when they were ready, and that was how they were independent and how you were independent from your family too. And I think, one of the things that with housing prices and the recession, the house became kind of like a home base for the family rather than your stake of independence a little bit. And so in a way, I always think of it as maybe a more actually traditional way of viewing a home, is rather than a home is my claim of being an adult, a home is the space that I bring my family in and I protect them when they need to be there, and then I'll let them go back out. And millennials tend to, I know it's frustrating to have them living there, but I think a lot of them, there's not a lot of shame with it, because there's shame if you're not doing anything, right? So if you are one of those millennials we hear about sitting in the basement, playing video games and not working at all, I think those are much more rare than people would understand. What most millennials living at home are doing is getting an unpaid internship in a career that they couldn't otherwise access if they didn't take an unpaid internship. Or they're underemployed because they want to have a job at a specific startup, or they're continuing their education because they know that education is the biggest indicator of your financial success in the future. And so they're staying in that home as a base longer and longer. And I think it's doing positive things to the intergenerational connection too. One of the interesting stats that I see is about 8 out of 10 Americans told Pew Research that they think that there's this big generational disconnect. And that makes sense because we all think of the generations as being different. But the last time that number was that high was when the boomers were taking to the streets and marching and basically burning down the system. So there's something big happening in this sort of separation, and both sides cite technology as that. But I tend to think of something as sort of the traditional rooting back into the home as the home base as maybe that way that we can get over that intergenerational disconnect that we're all kind of feeling.
Do you think there's any relationship between it and the nature of the helicopter parent, intense and structure?
Absolutely. I mean, parenting is going to change, and parenting is already changing. Just to be clear, Gen Xers basically look at millennials and say, I will not raise those children, and they are fighting against everything that boomers did. And so there's a free-range parenting movement. There's all of these things that are happening. There's actually...
What does that mean?
What is that?
What does that mean?
They call it free-range parenting, and you're supposed to let your kid walk to school by themselves, let them do their own homework. You let them fail. Basically, it's focused on allowing them to fail and and understanding that failure is fine, rather than focusing on success. And millennials we were very primed to need to be like the top percentile. We were focused on the percentile of everything at all time. But I don't even remember what the start of this question was. I'm sorry, but yeah, I think that there is sort of this move to changing what parenting looks like because of the helicopter parenting, and I think basically boomers did it out of good intentions. Basically, they saw their parents as being kind of absent, and so they said, I want to give my kids all of the love, and I know how tough it is, and I want to give them a safe bubble to be in, and I want them to have everything. And it was only out of being really positive towards their kids. But what it did is it created a generation that doesn't know how to pay their own cell phone bill when they're 27 years old. And there is problems with that too. And so while I do love that we're all coming into the house, at the same time, I think it's good in a way that we're moving away from this kind of over helicoptering parenting situation, because you have these kids that when they emerge, they're so high anxiety because they don't know how to do normal things and they don't know how to fail, that the idea of failure is so fearful for them that they kind of go back to resting on their parents and using their parents as sort of the thing that they fall on, when the truth is that you just got to fall on your own knees and get up. And so that is something that I'm hoping that we're going to instill in the next generation a little bit more.
That's, wow, all my failures as a parent are coming.
Right, exactly.
I don't mean it that way.
I'm writing it all down.
I think the thing is to remember is that
I'm
generations
sorry,
are
kids.
cycles.
I feel terrible. Just remembering some Little League games. Yes, that was a stupid play, you idiot. Anyway, okay, sorry. Okay, I'll get over that. By the way, you hit on one of my flashpoints before I get to the real question,
Yeah.
which you hit on one of my flashpoints there, Maude, which was unpaid internships.
Yeah,
Really
me too.
conflicted about this as an economist. As a labor economist who believes in markets and free markets, I like the idea that if a company has something to offer and there's gains from trade to be had from a kid learning something in the firm, that, by all means, you should be allowed to do that. But in terms of exacerbating the inequality ideas, and I said there isn't a lot of evidence that it's gotten worse in terms of climbing or lowering the ladder, and I'm sure unpaid internships are a very small part of that, but when you think about things that contribute to that, I mean, if my kid graduates next year and wants to live at my house and take an unpaid internship that's going to look great on his resume and get him into graduate school someday, he can do it.
Yep.
And if his buddy from college, whose father, he actually, I'm not making this up, he has a good friend who fits this characteristic, whose father works as a maintenance guy, if he wants to do the same thing, forget it, he can't do it. Nobody's, he doesn't have the same option. So I feel very conflicted about that, and it worries me. But it's hopefully a small issue in the scheme of things. So when I think of the living at the house, I thought of it from a different perspective. Again, you thought I disagreed with you before. I don't
think you disagreed.
I haven't disagreed with you yet. I just thought of it from a different perspective. When I think of kids living at home, I think there's a nice economics paper about this. This is just a form of insurance. Mm-hmm. Your parents are your insurance. And there's a nice paper, I think he's your colleague, Orly, Greg Kaplan, doesn't he work at Princeton now? Wrote a very nice paper about the value of the insurance, of being able to move back in at your parents' house. And so then what I'm curious about, and now we're getting into social norms, which takes me way outside of my area of expertise. When you said that millennials are more comfortable living in one house and so forth, I wonder if that's just because they graduated at a time where they didn't have any choice but to do that, and that's the social norms developing around that generation, rather than there was anything inherently different about them. They just, you're shoved into that situation, you adopt to it. And whereas, I never moved back into my parents' basement, and I can't imagine, that from that perspective. But anyway, that's
No, I think that's totally right. I mean, there's a not stigma with it as long as you're doing something with it. So there's stigma in being lazy, 100%. But if you're saving because you're trying to go to grad school or all of those things, there's no stigma whatsoever. It's considered smart because I'm sure you guys as economists know they're conservative with cash and they want to be able to save cash and they have a tendency to try to, I say, squirrel it away because they're so nervous that it's going to disappear at some point. And so they see this as just another opportunity to squirrel away that cash.
Well, why don't we, here we go, okay.
You had mentioned that the millennials were getting married later. And is that because of their personal financial situation that they're not finding jobs? Many are moving back home with their parents. So that independence and getting married is, pushed out.
I can tell you on a qualitative level, I don't know any really good research on this, but it's interesting because they are getting married later and later, and the average age of marriage keeps going up really quickly. And it's I think it's 29 for women right now and 30 for men, which seems super normal to everyone here. But then you add in Alabama and Arkansas, and that's what I always try to make people remember is that is really, really late. I think this has a couple of things. I think it is partially because we hear a lot that they want to be economically stable before they get married. And, marriages cost so much money. Actually, the average price of a marriage in America is like $27,000 right now. Yeah, it's insane. And so it's, if you think about it and you have all of this commercial pressure actually to have the perfect wedding, a lot of people that I talk to are saving, like they're in a couple that they know that they're going to get married, but they don't want to do that yet because they're saving to be able to pay for the marriage. That's more of my Midwestern friends that aren't so much this crowd, but I see that happening a lot. And I think that is one element, and I think another element is people, though they want to believe in marriage, I would say millennials still want to believe in marriage. There's an inherent understanding that a lot of them fail, and so marriage isn't a qualifier for being an adult anymore, and oftentimes no longer even a qualifier for having a partner, having stability, or having a kid. And so I think the marriage rate is going up partially because of that, which again means that they're kind of in this cohort space longer because they are marrying later. Another really big element that this part I do have research on is women, basically, and all the stuff you've been talking about with women. And if you think about it, women used to wait for a partner to select them, but now women in a lot of ways are waiting for a better partner. And there's still a societal norm where your partner has to make more than you. They have to be more successful for you. That is still there. That is, trust me. Like I've seen friends get married where the husband makes less and people are just like, I don't know how that's going to last, and everyone's nervous about when they're going to have kids. It's like, maybe he'll stay home. But that norm is still there, but the problem with that, and I'm sure you have a lot more research on this, is that in urban areas, women of millennials' ages are actually out-earning their counterparts, and so all of a sudden you don't have available partners that women think are attractive for them, and so they keep pushing getting married off further and further as well.
Yeah, I totally, there are two great economics papers that sort of get at what you're saying, but I when you talk about delaying marriage, I think it's all just women are doing better in the workforce. Why would they rush into getting married? And there are two great economics papers about this. One is an old one that just shows how the pill changed the labor market dramatically. And then there's a recent one, I'm sure you know this paper, by Marianne Bertrand, Amir Kamenika, and Jessica Pan, and they have a very interesting finding, which you just hinted at, which is that marriages and relationships where the man makes more money are much less stable than, the man makes more money are much more stable than those where the woman makes more money. It's very, and the way I think about that is,
And there's fewer unions that even happen in the,
Exactly.
in the, basically lining up with what
the
you said.
social norms have changed. It's not, women don't need men that much anymore, is what it's.
I love you.
Remember Murphy Brown? That was like this big deal. And
Right?
now,
Yeah.
you know, single mothers are single mothers. They do need men for one thing. There's one
Barely.
moment, but he doesn't even have to be there anymore. So.
Up here in the front.
So I got a question for each of you. Paul, on women, we at Draper University we get, you said 18%. That's exactly the percentage we get of applicants for this entrepreneurial program. And you'd think this would be the time women would say, you know, glass ceiling, nothing. I'll paint my own ceiling and I'll start my own business. So I'm thinking that why are those two associated? And then one for Maude. I'd like to know what your thoughts are on this because I hang out with these students all the time and I start to see there are a couple of things that have not worked well in the raising of these millennials, a few of the millennials. And here's what it is. If you're a boy and you're 8 years old, they call you ADD.
Yep.
And if you're a girl and you're 16 years old, they call you depressed. And they give you brain drugs for it. And or if you're not the top of the class, you get Ritalin so you can concentrate better. And then all of a sudden, there are these people who are basically have been living on brain drugs this whole time, and they're coming out with vapid. And I'm wondering if you feel that way too. You see some of your friends that are kind of like vapid, like they've
Well,
lost.
they wouldn't be my friends then, would they?
Anyway, those are my two questions.
So just Hilary might know more, as much or more, I would say, about your question than I do. I mean, there are two possible reasons why women would have much lower entrepreneurial rates. One of them is social norms, which will change over time, and you'll see that number rise. And then the other thing, which is certainly part of it, is biological differences. So I'm probably now I said I wasn't going to get myself in hot water, but I'm about to. So there are evolutionary biology reasons why you might think this is true, but in the data, it's clearly true that women are more risk averse than men. And so that's just a true fact. And so, like I said, that could be a social norm that'll go away. My guess is that not all of it is a social norm. And so you'll always see everything else equal some difference there. But
Can I answer his question too?
yeah, sure.
I would say actually, I think that's. I don't know about the biology. I don't know any of that. But the thing that I also see, and to the business community, is that you guys close untraditional doors, and not so. Yes, maybe women aren't majoring business. I did not major in business. I was an anthropology major. But you know what? I'm good at business, and it doesn't mean that I shouldn't have access. But I think we tend to create very linear paths for people to get into business. There's the MBA, there's the entrepreneurial program. It's interesting to me that if you were an entrepreneur, that you would go to an entrepreneurial program. But personally, I just think that maybe we should potentially be looking at.
Check it out. It's a little different.
I mean, I believe you. I'm just saying I've seen this personally because I spent a lot of my time in rooms with older men, and they're always like, well, why isn't there more thinking like yours? And I say to them, well, you've never opened a door for those people. How would they know how to access this room? I've been lucky in that somehow, and it is that mix of luck that you've let me in. But at the same time, even a woman, when she gets into some of these settings, suddenly has to become a man. And it's we take thinking and we try to create a very linear path sometimes to give access to business or entrepreneurial routes. And potentially there are other routes that you can have. And for me, I get a lot of, I also went to journalism school, and I go back and talk to my journalism, and one of the lectures I give to them is how to make money as a journalist, and it's to not be a journalist. And so I give them other paths in, but I say to them, you have all of this great analytical thinking and research, and these are kind of minds that need to be in business, and they need to be there as well. And so I think sometimes if we would open other doors, you would see that women would come through them, but maybe not through the route that men have defined as the route to get there. Sorry, I didn't answer your second question. It's so hard to have an opinion on what drugs are doing to people's brains because I don't understand the science behind it. I do think we have a fetishization of success at a youthful age in our society. As was mentioned, I was on the 30 under 30. Interestingly enough, about a year before, I wrote an article about how the 30 under 30 was destroying people because I honestly think it's so random, and it's one of those things where all this pressure to succeed while you're young takes away your youth. And I think that the things that you're talking about, I see with boys too. It's like, yes, they're into random things. That's what 8-year-old boys are into, and everyone's like, no, they need to be focused. And it's like, again, I think that is too much pressure on a linear path towards success. And I think if the more avenues that we open that are through the side door, maybe we'll have less pressure even on those boys to be one certain kind of way to get to that path of success.
So I just want to make a comment, though, on your comment about linear thinking and not hiring people like from anthropology. That's diversity and inclusion.
Yeah.
And it's funny how when you think about diversity and inclusion, people don't necessarily think about they don't take it that far, but yet it's absolutely part of it. But so I have a couple of questions that are different questions, and the first question is in regard to this separation of inequality. And over the course of the years, you've seen so many universities and colleges develop these programs that are funding so many underprivileged kids to make sure that those who do have the skills and do have the ability get into them. And I'm curious as to what impact that made. And then my second question has to do with the millennials in terms of moving back home. And I'm wondering if part of the reason, too, is that they had older parents and they were, my parents' generation, it was like there's the kids and there's the parents. But when they grew up, we included them so much more in our parties and in everything we did that, and now in the workplace, you also now see, a variety of wide generations that are working together much more effectively. So it seems like that generation gap and ability to communicate has narrowed. And I'm wondering if that too has an effect, because there's not this stigma of, my parents are old, and I don't want to be anywhere near them. But there's just a much more closer relationship, and I'm wondering if you're seeing that as well.
Well, just quickly on the college side, again, Hilary may know more than I do here. I think the answer is not much. I think we're doing a great job at Stanford and many of the other schools at doing some outreach to get these kids in there, but they're still very small numbers. And so you're having a huge impact on small numbers of people, huge positive impact on small numbers of people's lives. And I think that's great, and we need to keep doing that. The other side of doing that is as an economist, I'm always amazed, there's no industry with the price discrimination we have in this, right? You buy a car, there's a little difference in how much you negotiate. You go to college, my kid pays less than the full freight here because I work here, but if you have a fair bit of income, you pay even more. And then if you come from a poor background, you pay. Hilary works at Berkeley. If a poor kid goes to Berkeley, they pay much more than they pay to go to Stanford, actually. It's an incredible, a poor kid doesn't pay to go to Stanford. They literally don't pay. It's a wonderful thing, but it's having, the simple answer is it's small potatoes in the bigger scheme. Would you agree with that?
Right. The fact is, like, the UC Berkeley has more, the fact that our chancellor likes to say, more Pell Grant recipients than the entire Ivy League put together. So, it's a different margin. But
they're also getting more and more pressure to take the out. I know they're fighting back. Janet Napolitano's fighting back on this as we speak, but there's more and more pressure to take out-of-state kids at full freight.
Well, it's 30% now at Berkeley. Right. Right.
So I don't think you're correct.
Right. So at UC Berkeley, it's
$100,000 of family income. You go to UC.
Oh, okay. You can go to Stanford for
although
free,
that
too.
that only covers tuition, not room and board. But
No,
it's
here you get room and board as well. I think you have to put in a couple $1,000s, a nominal amount to, just to show you. But so it is actually cheaper if room and board isn't included there.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was true at Berkeley.
Well, Berkeley goes above. There's a UC plan called Blue and Gold or something, but then Berkeley tops it up to be much higher.
Our first in their family to go to college.
Yeah.
So there still is upward mobility.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But I think college cost does affect us greatly, because talking from personal experience, I didn't come up from wealth at all, and I got into a really good high school, so I was one of those lucky kids, one of the lucky few. And when we all got into college, I was watching my friends, and they get their acceptance letter, and they were like, "You got in. Does that mean you get to go?" And the answer was no, actually. For a lot of the places that I wanted to go, and so it's I think that there is still that inequality within that space as well too.
The cost
Definitely.
of college, that's been an incredible steady march, and it's just going to continue if we keep the traditional college model, because unlike every other product, education is labor intensive and the cost goes up. It doesn't go, relative to inflation, it doesn't go down. So, now you hear about all this are we ready for disruption in the industry and all that sort of stuff? Hopefully not until about 20 years from now.
Thank you. My question is to Paul on the empirical side and to Maude on maybe the attitudinal side. It has to do with the urbanization, or not, I think the urbanization of the millennial generation. I see a lot of companies relocating. We heard Larry from the Giants in the last session, the general session, talk about the real estate development across the street from the ballpark, in part to attract companies from the Valley that are seeking to tap into the talent pool in the city. I'm from Chicago, and over the last 5 years, I've seen numerous companies move from the suburbs. They're already in Chicagoland, but they're moving to the city because they need to capture the optimal talent pool. And they're speaking to millennials when they say that. I'm curious if you could comment on the data and the attitudes.
You might, I keep trying to get you to show your expertise, which is vast. You might be able to speak to this better than I can. I think it's clearly true that there's been some urbanization, but again, I think it comes down to the haves and the have-nots a little bit. So San Francisco is an urbanizing city. People want to live there. New York, we've all been to nice cities and how much better they were than how much safer you feel now than 20 years ago. That's an incredible trend. Having said that, if you go to Tulsa, it doesn't, so it's a certain set of cities.
And it's not specific to the millennials either. I think it's,
Right.
My parents are moving back to the city as
Right.
well, and many of you, I'm sure, live in the city as well. So I don't think it's particular to the millennial generation yet. Again, that's an important young cohort that employers want to tap into.
Yeah, I would say it's just about optimization. I think all of us are looking for ways to optimize our experience, and that's something we're focused on as a generation and as a country. And if you think about what being an urban person is, it's you can optimize your time because you can do so many different things within a single day. Whereas if you live, and you have to commute far places, all of a sudden you're dropping your level of optimization.
A question, maybe this is a great qualitative discussion, but a question on quantitative. Part of the problem is they're born in 1980, and so the first ones are turning 35. And so is there maybe anybody who's doing the cohort analysis quantitatively on 80 to 90 to see what's happened to those people, to compare it to like the first 10 years of the Ys and, back through that, to see how are these qualitative insights showing up in quantitative measures?
I mean, that is such a great question because one of the big things, it's a massive debate within generational experts at least. We say 1980 between 2000, that's when millennials are born, that's the big number. A lot of us use that number because that's the number Pew Research established. So in order to track trends over time, it's kind of the base of data that you have to work with, But, there is an argument to make the generations shorter and shorter. And there's even an argument, to not even talk about it within generations anymore and talk about it within, time periods. And because there is this younger half of millennials are so different from the older half of millennials. This is a massive group. And it's funny because we sit here and we talk about generalizations, but it's 80 million people roughly. Not every single person is going to fit into that generalization, obviously, and we're trying to look for the broadest ways to talk about them, but it is true that the younger ones have some key differences. And the way Pew actually researched, they released some research that they showed that Gen Xers the older ones were much more similar to boomers, and the younger ones were more similar to millennials. And then within the millennial cohort, there was a lot of similarities just because they're big and they tend to communicate a lot. But the younger generation tended to be even connected to that other generation that people are sometimes calling Gen Z or whatever. Nobody knows what their name is really. They just make them up and try to get famous from it right now. But it's, no, that's true. But it's like, so everyone sees that there's some similarities with what sometimes people call as digital natives too.
I still wonder, I guess the question is there slices.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and
Yeah.
you start looking at 10-year those 10 years and see whether or not you see it.
And there's an organization called YPulse that's doing that, and so they're like a millennial research organization, but they cut their data actually by like 5 years, and so you can get access to like broad swaths of data about like specifically kids born between this age and this age. I think another big reasons that at least that brands talk about millennials as a whole is because they're trying to achieve business objectives, and it's easier to think about them in this big way than it is to try to narrow the niches out a little, but there are people studying the differences.
Great insight so far, and love it. But just a question. Earlier, Steve and Ursula made a comment as far as the number of jobs you'll have in a career. And, I've got different views. I think we all have different views. But would you agree with, making a difference, the experience, the manager, when you have all that, are the trends that you're seeing, are they going against that 7 or 8 jobs in a career?
No, but that doesn't mean that they don't stay once they find the right one, right? So if you think about where we are, and you probably know this much more than me, but just qualitatively, it takes you a couple tries, right? You try out a few things, and then you get there. One of the things they do want, when we hear about this all the time, because some of the work I do is going into like big companies and helping them figure out how to work together better and retain people. But the biggest thing is they want to be able to have a different career in the same organization. And so if you have a space, if your organization allows for that, that's why when they were talking, I was like, right on, millennials are totally staying at your organization. You're letting them move countries, you're letting them test different things, you're letting them be entrepreneurs within the organization. That is what they're looking for, and that is often enough to retain them for quite a while.
Can I bolt on one thing to that?
Yeah.
So whether it's an internship or a co-op, if a student can lock in and they've got a couple different experiences as they're going through their collegiate career, if they can lock in and they find that right job, do you see that trend with them staying with that company longer?
I think this is more a question for
Well,
you guys.
So there's I had two reactions to the question and to Maude's point. One is, I tried to find an update on this. My advisor at Princeton, Hank Farber, wrote a series of papers about 10 years ago saying have long-term jobs. At that point, the world thought long-term jobs were over, right? So if you think we thought it then, we think it even more now. And at that time, the answer was no, nothing had changed. Okay, now I haven't seen anybody update that, and I am curious as to whether or not that's happened, and I just don't have as good an answer for that as I would have liked. Maude's point is, I think, interesting, this idea of you stay in the same organization and move around. That's going back, that's sort of like a Back to the Future type of thing. That's like an IBM career 40 years ago. It's like, come work here forever and you'll move from job to job. And, when I worked at the Kellogg School in my first job, you'd have companies like in consumer packaged goods and banks that would hire MBAs for training. They would have a rotation program at the beginning, and then you'd get sent into something, and that was kind of the career path. That kind of became very out of fashion. No MBA wanted, nobody at the GSB will talk to a packaged goods company right now, much less take that sort of thing. But we'll, so I don't know. The data are still not known.
I will say training programs are coming back in style at internships,
Yeah,
massively,
exactly.
but I don't have data behind it at all.
Right.
Part of my question was his question about just retention of employees for longer, but I'm part of an organization where we hire usually at least 380 for the division that I'm part of right out of undergrad, and so we're constantly looking at this. But one thing you were talking about in terms of this generation always needing praise and used to praise, when I find in feedback sessions, they say they want feedback, but really what they want is positive feedback. And so the question around sort of how, as organizations, do we help develop, mentor, and the way we talk to them to help both go towards their motivations, but also not just constantly give them that gold trophy?
And see, I think mentor is the perfect word, actually. The thing is often if often when you get yourself in a position where you're getting feedback, it's not because that person has been mentoring you. That person might have no relationship to you. Sometimes it's an HR person that's reciting feedback from anonymous sources. And I'm not saying that's how your organization works, but it's one of those things where that doesn't, it's like, okay, I've gotten this feedback. I have no idea what to do with this next step. When you have mentorship programs in place, we see that millennials are a lot more comfortable with positive and negative feedback because they know that they have a relationship and they know that they know how to move forward from that negative feedback. They can figure out with you what the next step is to correct it, rather than necessarily just being sad that it happened. I find personally when I go and work with these organizations, the biggest issue is that feedback is being given in a way that makes them feel like there's no telling their side, we often hear. So they feel like you don't really understand what's happening in the day-to-day. How can you even give me this feedback? You don't know who I am or what I'm doing, and you're not invested in me. So when you add a layer of actual mentorship onto that, all of a sudden the feedback becomes important, and they want to hear, I mean, they do still want to hear more good things than bad because they're human, right? And they're still developing and they're trying to figure out if they're going on the right track. But at the same time, they're much more open to negative feedback because they can at least work with you to course correct it in a way that feels real.
Okay, well, we have reached the end of this really lively session. I thank our panelists and the great audience questions. Thank you very much.